Okay, hi everybody. Welcome back to another edition of Tuesday Talks, sponsored and produced by the Gordon Jewish Community Center. We're so happy to have you here today, as always. And if you've missed any of our past Tuesday Talks, please check out Gordon JCC YouTube, and you can find them all there. So today, I'm really excited because I love Paris, but we'll get to that later. First, I want to introduce you to our special guest, and she's got a lot to talk about. She's the author Jane S. Gabin. See, now I messed it up. I thought I asked her, is it Gabin or Gabin? I want to get it correct. I said Gabin, but it's Gabin. But then there's a French way to pronounce it, which she will tell you in a bit. She is a native of New York City. Jane has taught in both secondary schools and universities. She earned her PhD in English at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Most recently, she has taught about World War II at the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute at Duke University. Currently an independent scholar, she has participated in numerous academic conferences and lectured extensively in the United States and abroad. She is a member of the Victorian Society of New York, the Alliance Française, and the Association for Jewish Studies. She belongs to Beth El Congregation in Durham, North Carolina, where she heads the Lifelong Learning Committee and is a lifetime member of Hadassah. The author of 3 academic books, Jane wrote The Paris Photo after finding unexplained pictures among her late father's papers. She has visited Paris many times in the years since, and we're so pleased and excited to have her here. So welcome, Jane.
Thank you very much, Carrie.
You're welcome. Take it away. Go for it.
So I've been an Anglophile. And in fact, I even ran a little British imports shop with some friends in Chapel Hill for a number of years. And I only visited Paris when I graduated college, that whirlwind tour of Europe that a lot of graduating students do. But despite the name, which of course looks like Gabin, it's Polish or Russian. Although I did have one eyeglass repair an optician in Paris who looked at my prescription and said, "Oh, Gabin." Anyway, but I knew my father had been there, and he passed away in a number of years ago. It was over 20 years ago. Seems like yesterday. And then I'm the only child. I was going through his photos. I knew he was there, and he took a lot of pictures. But then I found this one, which I had never seen before, and I'll share it with you. I'll try to get the light off of it. And there's my father with a family. And I thought, who are these people and why were they important to him? Because it's not in a military setting. It's not in a post office setting. It's in somebody's home. There are 3 women and there's this young boy. And all my father had written on the back, because there is this family disease, I suppose. It's a syndrome of only putting names or dates or nothing on the back of photos. So there were these last names, and there were 4 different last names. So I figured out which one was the child's. There was no information. My father had never told me anything about a family that he was friendly with, a civilian family. And I didn't know if they were Jewish or not. And I couldn't tell anything from the names. It happened that summer, that spring, the Paris phone book was on the internet, and I looked up the boy's last name. There were about 40 people. And so I figured I would have to write to all of them. There's no email addresses, only street addresses. And I didn't speak any French. So I happened to be working at the United Nations International School in New York, and there was a French department. And I went there, and I said, well, if I write a note, would you translate it for me? So I sent this short note, which I copied, and I made copies of the pictures. And I sent them to everyone saying, I am the daughter of the American soldier in the picture. Your last name is the name of the boy. This picture was taken in 1944. Do you recognize anybody? Most people didn't answer. Some people wrote back and said, I wish you luck, but I don't recognize anybody. Or I took this to my grandmother and she doesn't recognize anybody. But one night, very late, the phone rang and I hear this noise. And I said, who is it? Who is it? And this person heard my voice and he was crying and speaking French. And of course, I didn't understand anything except the tears. Finally, he said, Je suis le garçon. Je suis le garçon. I am the boy. He knew my father's name immediately because he said Sergeant Al, which I had not mentioned, my father's first name in the note. So I knew this was genuine. Well, it was the middle of the night. He was speaking French. I couldn't speak French. We spoke a little. We took a break. And then I realized I had to do something right away. I had to learn French. And I had to start writing. So I finally met him at the end of the semester. And this was 70 years after the picture was taken. And I thought, how cool is this? And he was very old. He was past 80. Well, that's not very old, but he was past 80. And of course, he was still alive and still in command of all of his mental faculties. And I started realizing how lucky I was just to listen. I basically wanted to learn more about my father. And what I learned was he was like a member of the family. My father didn't go there just once, but practically every week. Georges told me, he says, your father, he was practically a member of the family. He came all the time. Georges' father was, you notice that there are no men in this picture. There was the father and the grandfather of the family, and they disappeared in the first roundup. Now, being the child of people, the grandchild of people who came from Russia, I knew about the Holocaust elsewhere, but I didn't know all the details. So I set out to research the history of the Jews in France. And I suppose at a certain point, I thought, this is a cool story because I made this discovery about my own father, and how likely was it that I find this person and hear about my father from him? But I didn't think I could write a traditional history of the encounter. First of all, I'm not a historian. And second of all, an article, this American soldier met a Jewish family. And it turned out, of course, they were Jewish. A little bit later, I found out. And I decided to fictionalize it. I'd never written fiction before, but I knew the difference between good fiction and not good fiction. I thought, I can do it. That's sort of braggadocious. But I wanted to try. At the same time, when I started doing this research, anti-Jewish activities were few in the United States and few in France. By the time this was published, just a few years later, things had been ratcheted up quite a bit. And I wanted people to see how easily anti-immigrant and anti-Semitic feelings can change into action. So I'm watching French politics as well. I was on a really great learning curve, and in a few years, from the time I first met Georges to the time the book was published, I made several trips to Paris, I learned some amount of French. I can read French now. It's very difficult for me to speak, but usually because I'm intimidated. But I can say correct things. I can go out into the public. I couldn't give a talk like this. I can have brief conversations. I know a lot of history. Plus, I got a lot of help at the Memorial de la Shoah in Paris. And I'll tell you, I had an encounter there that was very special. But I made some connections with the Jewish community in Paris as well. So now I feel like I understand quite a bit more. At first, when I met George, he said he was thrilled to meet me. And he said, one thing we never understood is why your father never communicated with us after he left Paris, which bothered me as well. It's at the very, very least rude. And so I was left with this question. And I felt that I was there as sort of the representative of my father's spirit. And I stayed friendly with George. He just passed away in this past October. And I was in touch with him. You know, we saw each other. I visited Paris every year except 2020. But we wrote, and I called him a lot, and we spoke. He would always say the same thing. I don't want to talk about the past. Then he would spend the next 3 hours talking about the past. So, of course, I didn't want to take out a notebook and say, just one moment, let me get this down. I had to remember things and then write them down in the evening so as not to be rude. But his father and grandfather obeyed the first edict that came through about Jews. Jews, male Jews, above a certain age, were simply asked to register at their local police station. That's it, just register. And they must have had a conversation about that. And they went down and they registered. Then they didn't come home. So George's mother went to Drancy. They had been taken to Drancy, which is a suburb in the northeast of Paris. And the train from Charles de Gaulle Airport has a stop in Drancy. And when you come to that stop, I just feel like a shudder go through me, because Drancy to me meant a way station on the way to Auschwitz. But people got on and got off, and they didn't notice it because they lived there. It was their suburb. It was, on the way to work. At that time, and I went there as well. When it was built, it was in the 1930s. It was not quite late 1930s. It was built as a housing project for poor workers, because then, as now, it was a working class suburb. And they weren't quite finished with the building. The forecourt around which the buildings were congested was bare, and they just did barbed wire around it and guarded it with French police and shoved prisoners in there. When I looked at books with photos from the early years, I was really shocked, because there is no look of panic on anyone's face. Yeah, people were annoyed to be there. It was a nuisance. But you didn't have a sense that people the next stop would be. They had no idea what the next stop was. And I also saw photos of people who had been prisoners there with suitcases, walking, escorted by the police to the train station. They were being deported, only by French police, only French. The Nazis weren't involved until later. But in the beginning, it was the French police. And first of all, any complaint that, whatever happened to the Jews in Paris, it was because of the Germans. Ultimately, but the Germans and the police were like, the Germans and the French operated together. The other thing I noticed in Paris, because while I was there primarily to visit Georges and his family, I wandered around a lot. And I've seen a lot of Paris that's, not just the great monuments. I wandered the streets. And I started noticing a great discrepancy. There were these plaques that usually began with the words, ici tombé, here fell. And they would be plaques in memory of a resistant or somebody who died in the battle for freeing Paris in August of 1944. It was after the D-Day invasions, but before the liberation of Paris. But it was in the last weeks of Paris. And there were many of these. There were plaques also in front of every school. In fact, there was a school on Georges' block. And these were usually black, big black marble plaques. And this one said, of course, in French, from the school were taken, how many children by the Nazis with the collaboration of the Vichy government. Never forget. And there was a date. And all the dates were from 1999 was the earliest, and it went to 2011, 2012. There was 50 years between the first Ici Tombe plaques and these plaques. And there is a plaque in front of every school. In fact, I found one plaque in a courtyard from this home was taken, and they list women and their babies. 4 months old, 9 months old. And why is there a 50-year gap? Well, because for 50 years, the French denied any complicity in the Holocaust. Not until 1994, when President Chirac acknowledged and accepted and declared guilt, French guilt, did this come out. Now, the Klarsbergs, who are, their names are like they're saints in France. Serge and Beate Klarsfeld did most of the work of memorializing the people lost in the Holocaust. And so he compiled these great books, which are now, they're available online, but they're in the Memorial de la Shoah. And it shows, because the Germans kept such phenomenal records, all the people who were deported, anybody lost in the Shoah, and there were 76,000 lost in France. They're all in this book. So I looked up Georges' father and grandfather. It had their names and addresses, year of birth, place of birth, original language, and profession. And the names range from real old world names like Naphtali, Yuda, Avraham, to more modern names as the years went on, Regine, Philippe, people with traditional French names. Anyway, I got all of this information, and then I put it into this book, which you've seen, and I wrote it as fiction. I changed all the names, but I got in what I wanted to include. That is this family mystery and how it happened. Georges told me about his mother, and there were two different stories. There were the things that she did for him when he was a boy, and he said, "My mother gave me life twice. Once by giving birth to me, and the second time by moving me around so that I would always be safe from anybody wanting to capture me." She had the three things that any Jew who wanted to survive in Paris during those years needed: a set of false papers, somebody on the outside, because she did have a friend who was able to obtain only one set of false papers, and gave them to the mother, and a marketable skill. You had to have a marketable skill to survive. Georges said, "My mother was a wonderful sewer." And of course he meant seamstress. I had to explain to him the difference between a sewer and a sewer. But she was in the garment trade, as many Jews were, many immigrants were, but she was French born. Her husband, who was deported, was not. And so I had to take these things into consideration. She was able, with the false papers, to get another apartment. She was able to have a job because of her sewing skills, and she was able to support herself and her mother and Georges. On the other hand, Georges as a child, did not understand why he had to be moved all the time. He said, "All I felt was fear." Had he been able to get in touch with some of the groups, one of the groups that the Klarsfelds founded, and there are groups of sons and daughters of the deported, I think he would have felt some kinship. He would have had somebody to discuss his situation with, his emotions. But people did not talk, first of all, and they didn't talk right after the war. In fact, Georges was married in the early 50s, and he said he'd been married for a year before his wife revealed him that her family had been interned in one of the concentration camps within France at Pithiviers. People didn't talk. They kept it all inside, and some people adapted well, and some people didn't. I went to the museum, to the Memorial de la Shoah, which has a library, and it has a museum, and it's a wonderful resource. And they have an interactive display. So you go in there and you can look up on a computer. You can look on a computer by the transport number, by the name, and you can find out other deportees who was with your let's say your grandfather, your uncle on the transport, or who came from the same village. Well, I looked up his father and his grandfather, and their names were there, but no pictures. And Serge Klarsfeld himself said, "The time is over now for retribution against the criminals. The time now is to put a face to every name of the people who were lost." So I looked up the father and the grandfather, and of course there was nothing next to their names. There was no picture and there was no story. I had pictures. Georges had emailed me pictures of his father and his grandfather, And he himself would never send this. I did it. And I said as much as I could about his father and his grandfather. And in that way, I helped to memorialize them. I didn't tell him what I did either, because he wouldn't have agreed with it. So he had never even been to the museum until I took him. And as soon as he saw his father's name, which was about 20 minutes after we got there are huge, huge plinths with the names of all of the martyrs there and the years of birth. And he's, sorry. He left. He left after 20. He says, I just can't take this. It was something that was never healed within him. So that's what I tried, basically what I tried to do. I'm interested to hear all of your stories. And I especially wanted younger people to read this, to see that it was, how it was that it was possible for this kind of mentality to take hold. And unfortunately, as we've seen in recent months, this Nazi mentality, mob mentality can happen anywhere. Let me pause and see if there are any questions.
Okay, so I don't know. I'm going to ask Alex, who's behind the scenes, if we are we getting any questions coming in? Because she would be in charge to see that. Right now, I don't see any popping up in chat. No. Okay, so there's no questions. It's a little challenging for some of our members and viewers to figure out how to put questions in this format. We have to understand. So if anything, we get them later in emails. So we can maybe make some connections there. But for our live viewing purposes, I mean, this story is so fascinating to me. And I guess my question is, I started to think of, maybe I'd have to read the book, and forgive me, I haven't read it yet because I just learned all about you just recently and I haven't read the book.
Yeah.
It's a fascinating story, and now I want to know, but I don't know if you'll give this away. I'm wondering, did you ever find out the answer to why your dad, once he left Paris, never stayed in touch? Oh, it's an open-ended question? Oh, that's really fascinating.
Well, I try to give some explanation in the book, but it's not definitive.
And your dad was a soldier who...
My dad was actually in the postal service.
Oh.
He didn't fight. Although he was trained for combat, it was one of his that he didn't see battle was in a way a disappointment. But he told me, I put an anti-Semitic officer through a plate glass window. Wow. And my daughter at the time, my father was old and very, very ill and a little bent over. And she said, you did that, Grandpa? You? Cool. Yeah, she was proud of him for that.
So he came there and worked during the war in the postal area of like whatever it is to do in the war.
They did a year's training in England. This was his unit, and so they had to set up post offices. They had to streamline things very quickly, and they also had to censor all the mail that came in and went out. Mm. So this I explain in the book. So for men in my, until D-Day, the average soldier didn't really know, other than the propaganda, what was going on day to day. I sometimes substitute teach at the local high schools. So I remember one class that I had to teach, and this was in about 2016, and the students were reading Night by Elie Wiesel. And the teacher had written to me, do not teach them anything, across the top of the, the attendance sheet. But I said to them, what are you reading? Why are you reading it? They were mostly Hispanic kids, immigrants and children of immigrants. And I said, why are you reading this? I mean, this happened to people 80 years ago. Why do you care? And one girl asked a good question. She said, well, why didn't the American soldiers go in? I said, oh, because our soldiers weren't involved until 1944. Oh. And she said, but the people who were tortured and sent into these death camps, they were just ordinary people. They didn't do anything, did they? I said, no. Well, why did the soldier? So I said, okay, let's say that somebody said a few years ago, all your problems, it's because of these Hispanic immigrants, the jobs, the economic situation, all because of Hispanic people who move here. So this one kid stands up, he said, well, that's not true. I said, sure, it's not true. You know it, I know it, everybody here knows it. But if a politician says this to an audience that doesn't include any Hispanics and says it every day, and it's echoed in the media every day, every month, and this goes on for years, at a certain point, average people are going to blame Hispanics. And this is what happened in Europe with Jews. It's called the big lie, and be wary of it. So this is, people will believe anything, and some people will believe anything. You know, I read all of this, I read the propaganda about the Jews in France. I was very surprised to learn that there was more betrayal to the authorities, more betrayal of the Jews in Holland than there was in France. You know, we think because of the Anne Frank story that there was much more heroism there. There was much more heroism in France.
Why do you think it was that way in Holland?
I don't know.
Oh.
I don't know. There are books on the topic, but in France, there was a network of, you know, on the one hand, you know, we blame, you know, the Pope. The church didn't take a strong enough stand. The Catholic Church had its bad actors, but it also had its good people. There were children, Jewish children, who were taken in and hidden by churches and convents all over France. There was a very active resistance movement. And there were also the police, the French police. Among the bad French police were the good French police. A woman I befriended in Paris told me the story of her mother, and her mother was preparing to go out one day, and a policeman came to her apartment, and he said, "Hello, I'm coming back tomorrow. Tomorrow I'm going to arrest you. So my advice is, go out now, just as you, but don't come back. And before you go, put on some lipstick and walk slowly. Walk as though you couldn't care at all. But avoid the woman with the glasses who lives on the first floor of the apartment building." So there was a roundup of French Jews at this velodrome. And that was where they were going to be kept. And the night before, people were arrested. There were Jew hunts, you know, all over Paris and in the outlying areas. And I've seen police memos that say, you know, there are this many in this arrondissement neighborhood, and this many in that one, this in that one. And they were hoping to get something like 30,000. And they got 12,000 because people were warned. Some people were warned and just didn't believe it. They said, oh, it's not going to happen here. This is France. Liberté, égalité, fraternité. And there were other people who listened to the warnings and people who got out. There were police who went to certain apartments and they were empty. So the warnings did get out. By this time, Georges and his family were living, his mother, he was an only child also, and his grandmother on the other side of Paris. So they weren't involved. But the French government requisitioned French policemen, 9,000 French policemen, more than they had in Paris, so they had from the outlying area, and commuter buses, French commuter buses. And they commandeered the trains also to take people to Auschwitz. There was also a great deal of sabotage on the trains. The resistance blew up a number of trains. But the mindset of the Nazi, I must have read just about everything in English on the subject. And the mindset of the Nazis about getting rid of the Jews was more important to them than winning the war. There was a scene I read where 2 German generals were at Austerlitz station. And this is a train station from which most of the goods and the people were, it's on the eastern edge of Paris and were sent to Germany. And these 2 German generals were fighting. And one said, I need this train now because I've got wounded German soldiers and I've got to get them back to Berlin lest they be captured. Unless they die, I've got to get them home. And the other general said, no, I need this train. I've got to dispatch Jewish prisoners to Auschwitz. This was in August of 1940. You could hear the guns approaching the fighting coming into Paris. And the one who won, you can guess, was the general who needed to transport people to Auschwitz. They would let their own soldiers die before they would give up any Jews.
What do you, on your personal thoughts, what would they be in regards to the rise to anti-Semitism now in France and Europe in general, in general across Europe? It's like it seems it's been growing. It just seems like it's been growing.
It has. Some of it's tied up with anti-Israel political, whatever it is, they're going to find, people who hate are going to find a reason. And the Jews, it's such a, you would expect somebody to say, okay, come up with something a little original instead of always coming up with the Jews. Just like in the 1920s and the 1930s, some Jews are visibly Jewish and some Jews aren't. And visibly Jewish people are more likely to be attacked in the United States as they are in France, as they are in England. And when this happens, I've noticed it in France. This is, there was a Holocaust survivor who was at this point very old, Mireille Knoll, and she was beaten and killed by home invaders. The police were outside the door of her apartment and they could hear this going on, but they didn't move. Eventually, somebody was put on trial for it. And there were other things that have happened. Macron usually, has made the statement, France would not be France without the Jews. The Jews are essential, blah, 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 blah. It says all the right things, but it doesn't have, but what is the government doing? The government doesn't do very much. Corbyn, the thing with the fall of Corbyn in England. Anti-Semitism seems to be such an easy way out for haters. It's such a traditional, let's blame them. It just boggles my mind. Of course, anytime a Jewish person does misbehave, and Jews are just like anybody else, there are mostly good apples. There are some bad apples. When the bad apples get publicity, the anti-Semites revel in it, just like when anytime there's a criminal in the United States who happens to be Black people go, oh, we don't need that. It's the same sort of thing. And I can understand the need for the Shomrim, the Jewish Ambulance Society, just like I understand the need for, in 1970s in New York, the Jewish Defense League. Because if you can't rely on civic protection, what do you have? So far, there has been civic protection. I feel safe in the United States, Well, Nashville, you just had somebody detonate, in downtown. I don't know what your original thoughts about it were. It got quiet after that. But there were Nazis among the people who neo-Nazis among the people who rampaged at the Capitol. I don't understand the rise of anti-Semitism, the rise of Nazism, neo-Nazism. Although I think of neo-Nazism as something aberrant, I can understand nationalism, but when it veers into let's get rid of other people, that is aberrant. I have 2 grandchildren, and one of them was ready for preschool. And my daughter, who was married to a rabbi, she was saying, well, it was time for the eldest boy to go to school. I said, and where is he going to school? Well, Jewish school associated with a shul. I said, you are making him into the other. And she said, what am I supposed to do? And that concerns me, when people make themselves into the other.
Sorry to interrupt you.
Yeah.
We did have a question. You kind of
Yeah.
touched on it, so maybe expand on it. Somebody wanted to know the effect of Sarah Keyes on the French acknowledging their complicity.
That book was a real wake-up call. Although to people who living in France, it didn't tell them anything new. But there were a number of things written about the French complicity in the war. It didn't change behavior, though. It brought more knowledge. It brought more. But when these plaques first went up, it was controversial. De Gaulle himself was a big denier of collaboration. And he said, how do you quantify somebody who collaborated only 10%, or collaborated because, it was just to get extra ration coupons because she had to feed her family? How do you, or somebody who collaborated 50%, or somebody, he says, we're all French, we all have to move forward. And, something like 10,000 people were killed in the days right after the victory on the liberation of Paris, because they killed people who were collaborators, and they killed people who were, they thought were collaborators, who were innocent. And a number of innocent people might have been killed. The question of guilt or innocence, just like the question of people who wrote letters condemning their neighbors, they sent them to the police, and the police eventually sent them to the Gestapo. And we've all seen those films with, German boots are marching up the stairs. Things get twisted around, but why did people say their neighbors were this or that? Well, it could have been because they were right-wing nationalists and wanted to get rid of somebody they thought was a Jew out of their building, out of their country. Or it could have been somebody who had his eye on that person's wife or that person's apartment. And people collaborated for and ratted on compatriots for the most flimsy of reasons. So yes, this book was major in changing the attitudes of non-French. It might have been their first exposure to what happened.
So speaking about books, I want to, and we don't have much time left, so I want to just get back to your book for a minute.
Yes,
because it's such a intriguing and compelling story. I love that. It's reminding me of all these photographs I found when my mom, while she was dying, but then afterwards, I just took all these photographs home, and I look at them and I don't even know who these people are, and it's like a story. So I love that you took this like creatively, that you took something, and not just creatively, but really like historically expanded such a personal, from such a personal point of view. So my question, maybe I have to read the book, but maybe just touch on it a bit, is, so your dad befriended this family. So how did that even happen? Like, what is that relationship that he had with this family?
I said to Georges, I said, what are the chances? How did my father pick your family among all the, civilian families, and even Jews who survived through the occupation? How did he come to choose you? He says, he came looking for us. So there was somebody my father had met in the States, because he carried their address on a slip of paper for 2 years. Wow. Before he finally met them. And I said, what is the name of this? He said, I think it was a cousin of mine who went to New York. I said, what was her name? He says, I don't remember. I was a child.
Uh-oh. Everything okay over there?
No, my husband is being attacked by the cat.
Oh, no. It's horrible. How do you say cat in French on that note?
Chat.
Chat, right. C-H-A-T, right?
Right, right. Chat. Le chat mâle.
Yeah, right.
But there are stories, and it's very important for us to get these stories out, because the survivors are leaving us, which is why video testimony is so important. There are important stories beneath the surface everywhere and in closets everywhere. You found these pictures of that your mother had, Karen. Did she have names written on the back or places?
No, that really drives me crazy. I know I checked everything. And the good thing was before she passed away, I tried to get as much information so I could have something. But yeah, I looked for that. So no, they didn't. And they're just like these mysterious photographs. And I look at them and I'm thinking, wow, what is that story there? Like, who are these people? Who are in relation? So anyway, this is it's just fascinating. Maybe, do you have a website or just for our readers to?
Yes.
So why don't you give us some information and we'll kind of wrap it up.
You can find a lot of first of all, if you go on Amazon, the book's there. If you go to www.theparisphoto.com, there's a story there. So
okay, so theParisPhoto.com, and the book is The Paris Photo.
Right.
Jane S. Gabin.
And there are so many books. They keep coming out about Paris and World War II. I'll give a plug for something I read, just this past week, The Final Transgression. And I said, how likely is this that I was going to read this book? It's about Paris, Nazis, World War II. Yeah. It's from the civilian point of view. And also you see how right-wing politics can develop.
Well, we're seeing it in real time. We've seen it. So now we're in the midst of trying to comprehend that reality, I feel like, of what we're dealing with now that never seemed to me possible in this country, that I just did not see this coming. Or maybe I was just blind and not paying attention, but it certainly has awakened a lot of people. That being said, on a positive note, I hope your movie's made into a book is made into a movie. That would
Thank you.
Awesome. I would love that, to see that. It just seems like a great story to make a film about. And I just want to thank you so much for being here today. And was there a way if people want to ask you questions or get directly, or do they go to your website and they can say?
Yes, there's a phone number and there's an email. They could ask me questions. I'm always happy to answer questions. The one person in all of this that I feel bad for is Georges. Because even though he was very successful, he became an orthopedic surgeon. He was very unhappy in his life. He had no childhood, and just multiply this by a whole generation.
Yeah, right.
Very,
Collateral
very
damage on a human level that's hard to process and heal.
Mm-hmm.
Never too late, though.
Yeah.
So thank you for writing your book.
Okay, thank you so much for
healing.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you again, and we look forward to future talks with you.
I hope so. Yeah. If I finish my next book. All right.
Let us know. Okay.
Take care. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Hi, Alex. Are we still
Yes.
on?
Okay. Hi.
Are we off?
Yes. Sorry. Okay. Wait, hold on.